closing us in. Hello. Great, it works. A very warm welcome to you all for tonight's discussion of a review of Solvency II. Has it met its objectives? Which always gets me thinking that there's bound to be an answer saying yes and no, but there you go. By the retrospective on Solvency II Working Party, before we commence the meeting, I need to mention a few housekeeping issues. I'll put my glasses on so I can read them properly. Anyone wishing to claim CPD for this meeting is responsible for entering the CPD on their own online record. By collecting your name badge, your attendance will have been listed on the Institute's systems for auditing purposes. If you do not have a name badge, you will need to sign the registration form. The meeting is being recorded for publication in the British Actuarial Journal. So please, and I beg you to do this, clearly state your name before making your contribution. Please wait for a microphone to be brought to you before you begin your contribution, and make sure you speak into the microphone. May I ask that you turn off your mobile phones, I've just done it myself, as they do interfere with the Institute's sound system. It is not sufficient to mute the ringing tone. Your phone will still try to talk to its base, and this is picked up by the equipment and becomes an annoying buzz that everybody has to put up with. Finally, and most importantly, the fire alarm for this building is a siren alarm. Should this go off during the meeting, please make your way calmly and efficiently to the assembly point, which is the Jam House, turn right onto Queen Street and head along the road. I hope everybody knows where Queen Street is, because I'll be following you. I would now like to introduce tonight's topic with what can you say as an introduction to this topic? Solvency II has been in my day job since, it seems, forever. For an actuary working with net premium valuation method with profit insurers, as I did, the change to a realistic balance sheet has been fundamental. Boards have come a long way in the last 4 years. Actuarial techniques have had to be rethought from scratch. Risk is now fundamental to the job. I hope we are all going to join in tonight with the discussion. Please ask questions and make points. Do not be afraid of asking what seems a silly question. Sometimes those are the most fundamental to understanding the problem. Now, I'd like to introduce our opener for this evening, Paul Fulker from Nomura. Paul is head of ALM structuring for Nomura International plc, responsible for providing Solvency II solutions to clients, and in his professional capacity, chairs the Life Research Committee. He is also a member of the Life Board. Paul.
I've no idea how to make the slides work. Do they happen by magic? Or? Thank you.
Sorry, classic mistake. It's the green one you have to press on.
We're well prepared, as you can tell. So on behalf of the Life Research Committee, I just first of all like to start by thanking the Working Party for a very important and timely paper one that's been very helpful to us as a profession in providing input to things like the EAPA review of Solvency II and the Treasury Select Committee, both of which the Working Party will update us on later. But just to sort of set the scene a little bit for the discussion, I thought it would be worth, given we're looking back on a retrospective on Solvency II, of reminding ourselves how terribly badly timed Solvency II was. Solvency II was designed in the Goldilocks economy, the nice economy, the non-inflationary, consistent, expansionary world where things weren't volatile. And the final version of Solvency II, or what was supposed to be the final version, was adopted on the 10th of July 2007. It came with a nice report from the ECB saying it would have no impact on markets. A proud boast, it was based on sound economic valuation principles, market prices, and glowing report from the industry as well, very few issues raised. 30 days later, literally 30 days later, 9th of August 2007, BNP Paribas suspended redemptions on their ABS funds, the event that was celebrated last month actually as the start of the global financial crisis, the event that's largely regarded as kicking it off. And what was their reason for doing that? It was impossible to value certain assets. In other words, 30 days after Solvency II started, based on market-consistent valuation, we had a global crisis caused because we didn't really trust market prices anymore. All of the subsequent market turbulence arguably caused market-consistent valuation, the very foundation of Solvency II, into question. It also flushed out a whole load of other risks in the financial services system that we hadn't thought about before. And certainly as someone who works for a bank rather than an insurer, our rulebook was sort of torn up, thrown out of the window, and we started again. Maybe we should have done that with Solvency II, but we didn't. What we did with Solvency II was we had what was called the long-term guarantees package, a rather interesting political compromise, all sorts of national fixes, something for the Italians, something for the German industry, a bit for the Spanish, quite a lot for the UK actually, even though we don't like to admit it, all designed to sort of get us back to the answer we first thought of. And quite a lot of the discussion in the paper is about all these different elements, the matching adjustment, the volatility adjustment, the transitionals. All of them are sort of designed to get us back to what we wanted in the first place, which is something that's less reactive to market conditions. But it's a bit of a hodgepodge. In terms of the debate itself, 3 or 4 points I was keen to bring out, and maybe to flush out a bit of discussion. First of all, pros and cons of market consistency has to be quite key. I generally agree with pretty much everything written in the paper. One point I do have a slight divergence of opinion. It asserts very confidently, I think in at least 3 places, that there may be flaws in market consistency, but it is through market consistency that effective risk management is rewarded. Wouldn't necessarily disagree, but certainly playing devil's advocate, if I spoke to, I suspect, a lot of UK pensions actuaries or a German life insurer, they would probably argue that forcing people to match liabilities with overpriced, long-dated bonds is about as far away as you can get from effective risk management as you can think of. Or that similarly, prioritising short-term mark-to-market and your ability to be solvent in 12 months' time rather than your ability to provide long-term returns is, again, not really effective risk management. On the other hand, and again, something I think to bear in mind in the debate, the opponents of market consistency do owe it to themselves to come up with something better. To sort of take the Churchill quote of democracy and change government for regulation, Solvency II may be the worst form of regulation apart from all the other ones that we've thought of. Very interested in constructive discussions on how things could have been done better. Secondly, where's Solvency II too generous? A lot of the industry debate, if you saw the sort of presentations at the Treasury Select Committee, it was really all about the areas where either the capital rules should be reduced or the governance of Solvency II should be made less burdensome. We're actuaries. We should be wearing our public interest hat here. Where do we think Solvency II should be strengthened, not just weakened? And by the way, not just areas where we think the Eurozone has pulled a fast one, like the ultimate forward rate or something like that. Is the matching adjustment, I think the paper in 2.1.2 points out the matching adjustment is one of the biggest departures from market consistency and something we're planning to kick off some research on. Or on counter-cyclical premiums. The various questions the Working Party asked at the Life Conference, they got a very enthusiastic response to Proposition A. Capital requirements should be adapted to allow insurers to cope with sort of vulnerable market conditions. But again, if you look at the way counter-cyclical regulation has been applied in banks, perhaps it should have been a phrase more like B. Capital requirements should be adapted to force insurers to hold extra capital in benign conditions like today. Will they have got such an enthusiastic response? Is that what we think? Should insurers be putting aside more money now so they can release it later? I think we should acknowledge self-inflicted wounds. When we had the debate back in the spring after the Treasury Select Committee inquiry and the Institute's and the profession's presentation there was quite a bit of debate on the use of swaps, for example, as a risk discounting tool, as if somehow that was imposed on us by some nasty people in Frankfurt. Actually, if you look at the history, and I went back and dug it out for this presentation, the industry was the one arguing for swaps, the regulators preferred government bonds, and even when government bonds were used for everything else in Europe, we in the UK had a carve-out to be able to use swaps. So actually it was our idea in the first place. Similarly, the risk margin that seems to be one of the less beloved parts of Solvency II. Again, if you look back where it came from, it largely came from market-consistent embedded value developments. Again, if you look at the initial papers, the concept of this fixed cost of capital that people don't seem to like came from a paper from the CFO Forum, as far as I can make out. So it's easy to blame other people, but should we as actuaries at least admit that we perhaps failed to spot some of these things and be a bit more honest in the debate? I don't mean that as a criticism of the paper, but perhaps an easy mistake to fall into. And then finally, competing objectives. The Working Party's focus was to test Solvency II against its objectives. So they went back and looked what those objectives were. And does this work? Probably not. There they are. Improved consumer protection, harmonisation, effective risk management, financial stability. But how do you prioritise those objectives when they compete with each other? And are they even all good things? One of the worst, when the question was put both to the Working Party and the Life Conference, probably the biggest fail for Solvency II was providing harmonisation or consistency. Very few people thought it had really done that. Is that a bad thing? I think that's a good thing. If we've got 10 trillion of assets, which I think is what we have in the Eurozone under Solvency II, and all of those companies are regulated the same way, that seems like a recipe for a very pro-cyclical, volatile market to me. And the single market that Solvency II was designed to help facilitate existed well before Solvency II, and I don't see much evidence of it happening post-Solvency II either. So maybe that wasn't even a desirable objective. So again, interested in views from people on whether the objectives were the right ones. And again, if we were starting again, would we start with that set of objectives? With that, I'll hand back to Steve, who'll hand over to the Working Party.
Thanks, Paul. That's great. Please come down the front. There's loads of seats down the front. No worries. Thanks. Okay. I'd like to introduce three members of the Working Party who are here. First of all, I'd like to introduce the chair of the Working Party, Dick Ray, who has been working with strategic asset allocation, asset liability and capital management implications of Solvency II since the first quantitative impact studies came out. For the last 3 years, he's worked for BMO Global Asset Management, providing insurance solutions that are heavily influenced by Solvency II. Prior to that, he spent 15 years providing insurance solutions within investment banking. He is also the Deputy Chair of the Finance and Investment Board. We also have Dylan Brooks, whose current role is Financial Risk Manager at the Phoenix Group. Prior to that, he spent his career at Prudential plc and then Old Mutual plc, being heavily involved in the implementation of Solvency II and the development of their risk management frameworks at both of those groups. Dylan has been actively involved in Solvency II policy development since 2007 through trade bodies and his role as chair of the AAE Solvency II Life Working Group. And finally, we have Andy Pelkovitz. Did I get that almost right? Good. Andy is retired and lives in Germany after working in life assurance, mostly in the UK, but latterly in Germany as head of actuarial at Heidelberger Leben. I'd like to ask, who's going first?
Andy.
Yeah, Andy to go first. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody, and
Thank you to Paul for an excellent and insightful opening, which sets the scene and I hope provokes a good discussion tonight. We presented the paper in Edinburgh in May, and now it's a pleasure for us to bring it to Staple Inn. I will give a brief overview of the paper, and I'll then hand over to Dylan, who will provide an update of developments since the paper was written. Our chair, Dick, will respond after the discussion. Starting early last year, our working party has carried out a review of Solvency II to answer the question, has it met its objectives in relation to life insurance? There are 6 members of the working party, and we've also benefited from Chris Barnard's input. Within the working party, we've experience in consultancy, asset management, investment banking and life insurance, and a German, Irish and UK perspective. We've assessed Solvency II against its original objectives, which include those shown on the slide, which Paul also showed earlier. For the purposes of this paper, we took the objectives as given, but Paul has rightly questioned their relevance. We chose not to take deep dives on specific issues. There are other working parties doing just that. Back in January last year, we held meetings to kick off our thinking, and then later in the year we sought views at the Life Conference. These discussions and surveys helped inform the paper, and we'd like to thank those of you who took part. Moving on to the paper itself, the slide shows the structure of the paper. Section 2 is about market consistency. Is market consistency a desirable end in itself, or merely a useful tool to ensure a consistent approach to valuation? It's fair to say that the working party is not fully in agreement on this question, and in his opening, Paul's added to the debate with the help of Winston Churchill. Solvency II started off with the intention of being market consistent. Later in its development, changes were needed to make it acceptable to member states in the new economic environment. And as Paul has stated, these changes have departed from market consistency. We look at some of the departures, in particular the ultimate forward rate and the matching and volatility adjustments. We review the risk margin, which is topical at present. This has been criticised as being too sensitive to interest rate movements, too large and too difficult to determine. A further problem is that under the standard formula, hedging interest risk in the risk margin can actually increase the SCR. It's a real issue for UK annuity writers with adverse pricing consequences. The PRA has acknowledged these unfortunate consequences, and EIOPA will consult on changes later in the year. In our paper, we present several of our and other commentators' ideas for changes to the risk margin. These could be of relevance to either the EIOPA review or a post-Brexit UK review. A new working party has been formed to address issues relating to the risk margin, and I'm pleased to have been appointed as a member of that. The section also covers transitional measures. Of particular interest is the transitional measure on technical provisions, which is widely used throughout Europe to phase in much of the impact of Pillar 1. Moving on to Section 3, we assess capital requirements. We describe the standard formula and its many peculiarities and suggest a few improvements. The section also covers internal models. We see them as mainly positive, though we've listed a number of criticisms, including the approval process. Section 4 covers the impact of Solvency II on behaviour, starting with asset liability management. Solvency II has certainly changed ALM practice throughout Europe. The regime now generally rewards a matching of assets and liabilities. For UK annuities, the matching adjustment has had a huge impact on ALM. There's been a shift from gilts and corporate bonds to high-quality liquid assets. This brings positive economic outcomes with greater investment in areas such as infrastructure. However, some of the eligibility rules are too tightly drawn, adding to complexity. In some countries, for example Germany, there's a trend to extend the duration of assets to reduce interest rate risk. Procyclicality. The procyclical nature of market consistency is of concern. As markets fall or become more volatile, insurers either have to find more capital or sell assets. This requires them to de-risk in the same time frame as other institutions. However, we know that markets can overreact, many are not deep and liquid, and life insurers often don't have immediate cash flows to pay. So a capital regime that provides time to respond would be desirable and would bring Solvency II closer to meeting its objective of achieving financial stability. This section also covers product design and consumer protection. Moving on to Section 5, we assess Pillars 2 and 3. We believe that Pillar 2 has been a major success of Solvency II. The ORSA has similarities to the previous ICA regime. However, Solvency II has raised the bar considerably. Although onerous, the ORSA should embed a strong risk management culture. This section also looks at liquidity. Unusually, Solvency II is principles-based here. We believe this is appropriate for life insurers. And we explore Pillar 3, which has introduced greater consistency, detail and transparency into reporting and public disclosure across Europe. It's now far easier to obtain a high-level understanding of an insurer's balance sheet and corporate structure. On the other hand, in the UK, Pillar 3 has meant a loss of some of the useful detail in the PRA returns, for example, within the company's various sub-funds. We also think that parts of the detailed reporting do not justify their costs, and we question the value of some of the areas where detailed reporting is required, particularly asset look-through data. Section 6 looks at harmonisation. The introduction of detailed regulations across Europe should have resulted in a high degree of harmonisation, but there are areas where this has not been achieved. These include discretion, gold plating and interpretation of the regulations. Finally, Section 7 looks at Brexit, which Dylan will cover shortly. To summarise our views, Solvency II is an impressive regulatory regime that provides a wide-ranging standardised framework across Europe. However, when you look at some of the outcomes, it actually falls well short of what it sought to achieve. This may seem a harsh judgment, but the insurance industry has invested huge sums of money in implementation, and it's only right that a critical appraisal takes place. We've highlighted many of the issues and suggested areas where more work could be carried out. So I hope my whistle-stop tour of the paper has given you a good overview, and now I'll hand over to Dylan.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you, Andy. I first started work on Solvency II in 2007 at Prudential when EIOPA was conducting its early quantitative impact studies. I found it quite ironic that after UK insurers have spent so long preparing for Solvency II, that when it finally went live last year, the UK public voted to leave the EU. Before we move on to contributions from the floor, I'm just going to briefly talk you through some of the developments that have been taking place since our working party first published its paper in May. The Treasury Select Committee inquiry was launched in September 2016. The objectives included an assessment of the impact of Solvency II on the UK insurance sector and to consider the options we have in the light of the UK's decision to leave the EU. Naturally, the Working Party took a great deal of interest in this inquiry. The inquiry was closed in May due to Parliament being dissolved for the general election. As a consequence, the Treasury Select Committee didn't conclude its work or publish a report for Parliament. In July 2017, Nicky Morgan was elected by Parliament as the new chairman of the Treasury Select Committee to replace Andrew Tyree. At this stage, the committee has not announced a fresh inquiry into Solvency II. While the previous inquiry can't be reopened, the Treasury Select Committee can open a new inquiry on Solvency II and refer to the evidence which it gathered in the previous Parliament. During the inquiry, the Select Committee gathered 46 written submissions from industry stakeholders and conducted 3 oral evidence panels with delegates from the regulator, industry, and last but not least, senior members of the actuarial profession. And we're most pleased to have Andrew Chamberlain here today, who represented the profession on one of those panels. Many of the issues which were raised by industry stakeholders during the inquiry were similar topics that we discussed in our working party over the last year. The profession's invitation to provide oral evidence to the Treasury Select Committee was a good example of how policymakers and government value the independent, learned opinions of our profession. The working party welcomed the opportunity to provide some input into the profession's written submission. As outlined in our paper, the working party agrees with the profession's response in that a revision to the current structure of Solvency II would be preferable to a root and branch replacement. While the inquiry has now been closed, the work of the inquiry has not gone totally wasted. During the inquiry, the ABI wrote a letter identifying 23 concerns and issues with Solvency II. The PRA responded in writing earlier this year, explaining that they were open to reform on 5 of those 23 concerns, namely internal model change process, transitional recalculations, longevity risk transfer, external audits, and legal entity identifiers. We understand that since then the PRA has a joint working group with industry to come up with solutions to these issues by the end of 2017. Clearly, we can't talk about Solvency II today without mentioning Brexit. With the negotiations ongoing, UK insurers are faced with uncertainty over what the UK solvency regime may look like going forward and what degree of access they will have to the EU market. The Working Party sees both opportunities and threats arising from Brexit. There is an opportunity for the UK to adapt Solvency II to better meet its needs, and there is a threat that the UK may still be bound by the Solvency II rules in order to achieve passporting and equivalence, but with a diminished ability to actually influence those rules in Europe. In July 2017, the new chair of the Select Committee wrote to the Bank of England requesting a briefing on UK insurers' preparedness for Brexit and their contingency plans. The Bank of England responded, confirming that it's in the process of reviewing the risks after having received contingency plans from 254 insurers and 147 banks. The Bank of England is anticipated to reach its conclusions this autumn. We note from the Bank of England letter that the volume of Part 7 transfers and authorisations in response to Brexit could increase sharply, causing costs and strains on the regulator. This will no doubt keep many of the members of the audience today very busy over the coming years. EIOPA has also recently issued an opinion on supervisory convergence in the light of Brexit. The EIOPA advice appears to encourage EU member state regulators not to fast-track UK firms who are seeking relocations in the run-up to Brexit. More widely, EIOPA has been busy reviewing specific items of the Solvency II delegated regulation in order to respond to the European Commission's call for advice as part of its wider review of Solvency II. EIOPA's advice is staged in 2 phases, with the first set of advice being issued in October 2017 and the second set in February 2018. EIOPA has already issued a draft of its first set of advice to industry for consultation in July, and the first set of advice covers aspects of design of the Solvency II standard formula, and there are a wide range of topics covered, including simplifications, external credit ratings, and the loss-absorbing capacity of deferred tax. Across the EU, Solvency II will continue to evolve over time through the review mechanisms which have been built into the directive, and the latest EIOPA consultations are evidence of this process. Regardless of the political landscape, the UK still needs to comply with Solvency II for the time being, and embedding of Solvency II has continued over the year. In July 2017, the PRA published SS 317, which formally sets out its expectations of firms which are investing in illiquid assets within their matching adjustment portfolios, including equity release mortgages. This statement reiterates the high bar which the regulator has set for the risk management of illiquid assets. The Working Party viewed the trend towards insurers investing in illiquids as very positive, but noted that this has come at the cost of increased complexity of regulations. During the first half of the year, we've seen the first wave of Pillar 3 disclosures from UK firms. The published SFCRs of firms provide a wealth of granular data and information for the market to digest, and we're keen to see how the investor community will react to these disclosures and use them going forward. The Working Party felt that Pillar 3 reporting had been positive in the sense that it would encourage harmonisation across Europe. However, there were challenges and concerns raised around the cost and complexity, as Andy earlier alluded to. Finally, before handing over to the floor, I would like to thank both the Chair and my colleagues on the Working Party for the many thought-provoking debates that we've had over the year. It's certainly been a pleasure to be involved. I would also like to thank all the members of the profession who have enthusiastically provided us with feedback over the last year. Now, I'm pleased to hand over the session for comment, and we encourage all of you who have been involved with Solvency II to share your views and experiences.
Thank you, Dylan. The discussion is now open to the floor. I'm looking forward to an interesting and stimulating debate and would like to encourage as many members who wish to contribute to do so. May I invite anyone who thinks he or she may wish to contribute to actually bung their hand up now so that I can see the sort of numbers we're talking about? One. No one else? Everybody else perfectly content with Solvency II? No problems at all? We should go... I suspect other people will join in. A reminder that the meeting is being recorded for publication in the British Actuarial Journal. So please clearly state your name. It will help Andrew as well to remember who people are before making your contribution. Please wait for a microphone to be brought to you before you begin your contribution, and make sure you speak into the microphone. And with that, I'd like to encourage the first contribution, please. John.
My name is John Instance, and tonight I want to speak as a sort of a non-executive director at a small friendly society. So first I'd like to echo the chairman's comment about actually Solvency II has been useful in terms of, say, if you like, consumer protection or policyholder protection, in that boards of those type of organisations are much more aware now of the risks they're taking. And to that extent, I think, enhances consumer protection. I suppose the one big issue, of course, is the strain and stress on small organisations of such a major change. And despite all the hard work of the Working Party, what I would like to see is no change at all for the next 5 years or so. We lived with Solvency I for something like 30 years, or maybe at least 25 years, and there were some gradual changes. I mean, I suppose primarily the change into the ICA regime. But, it's about time, I think, that we actually sort of thought about just embedding what Solvency II does and actually start to think more about other issues, like thinking about what is good for the consumer, and the impact of technology on the way our business is going to be run. There are some very big strategic issues that I think, we haven't really had the time to face up to because of the stress of implementing Solvency II. And we should just recognise, I think, I agree with Paul, that there is no such thing as a perfect regulatory regime. What we've got is better than what we had before. And so to that extent, there is no right answer. There is no right number for the amount of capital that an insurer needs. There's a lot of subjectivity and judgment involved. But at least it's better than it was. Frankly, I don't care about harmonisation. And that's not just because actually our business is only in the UK. I mean, but actually, Europe isn't harmonised in terms of the way it looks at customers and things like that. Germany is very different from the UK. Spain is very different in terms of the way the customers think. And that comes out from a lot of issues around, I mean, sort of societal issues. We're much more in the UK into equity-based savings and investments than other nations who prefer guarantees. Tax, of course, plays a major impact in the way that products designed. So do we care really that much about harmonisation? And I suppose my final plea is that regulators love to regulate. And I used to be a regulator, so, I understand that. It's their job to regulate. And I think, actually, in some ways, the one good thing about Brexit is that our government won't be able to do anything else for the next 4 or 5 years. A silly point. But I think we should discourage regulators from doing regulation. They've got to sit back and look at what they've done and just manage it. Rather than say, let's have another inquiry and think about how we can improve the regulation that we've got. Because regulators will always find a reason to improve the regulation. And I suppose I look at some of the things, this idea, most people, as far as I can see, are targeting SCR ratios well above 150%, probably closer to 200%. That's a big margin over that takes a lot of volatility. If you like, there is a big counter-cyclical adjustment in these benign times already in the way things are. So I would be relatively relaxed at this stage and say, let's not do any more.
Can I have the next contender, please? If you don't, I'll ask one of mine. You have been warned. Okay. You have one. Yep. Fantastic. Good. Rescued everyone.
In at the last minute. My name is Stephen Finlay. I work at the Association of British Insurers. And so, in a different way, have been very involved, as you all have, in pulling together messages from our members about the implementation of Solvency II and the future. And when I was reading through your paper, I was really struck just by how much, I think, consistency there is between the conclusions that you have reached and the views that we have gathered from our members. Of course, there's overlap there between the memberships, but they are slightly different voices. When it comes to policyholder protection and risk management, yes, I think there has been a marginal improvement, but probably not worthy of the extraordinary cost and effort that has gone in to get us there. Pillar 2, absolutely sort of good practice and in many ways common sense. Meanwhile, Pillar 3, is excessive and really is difficult to see where the equivalent regulatory benefit comes from for all the implementation and indeed ongoing costs which firms are now spending on Pillar 3. So, and just to echo the previous sort of contribution there, one of the messages that we've certainly been trying to convey is there is now a need for a period of calm to let this bed down and one to avoid a permanent sort of state of change. But at the same time, it's not perfect. So we've got to be careful that we're not wanting to have our cake and eat it. There's some things that we don't want to see change, but at the same time, there are other things which are quite fundamentally flawed. I'm thinking about the risk margin for one, which would be good to see reviewed. I would like to end with a quick question, which is when I was looking through the results of the questionnaire, which are one of the appendices, what struck me was that the question, I think, where views were the strongest, both from the working group as well as the conference, and both across average and median, was the issue around about gold plating, where there was, I think, quite an overwhelming view that in the UK the PRA had gold plated. But then I think one of the accompanying comments talks about how you were unable to find any sort of evidence to substantiate that. And I was just wondering why you thought that was. and is, can that really be?
Thank you. Next contribution from the floor.
Hello, my name is Andrew Slater. I don't work in insurance. I'm here out of curiosity.
Always a good reason.
And nothing better to do this evening. Comments have been made that a lot of money has been spent on implementing Solvency II. Ultimately, that money is met by policyholders by increased premiums. There's talk of one of the objectives of Solvency II was to address failings in consumer protection. If a lot of money has been spent, it must have been a big failing. Can somebody remind me what it was?
Okay, I had that as one of my questions as well. My question is slightly different. I think there's a lot of documentation and costs around Solvency II. I don't know how much of that is to do with Solvency II, or whether it's just the new world environment in which we live, where no one trusts a professional if they say, I think it should be 4%. Anymore, you have to come up with... I had to come up with an 8-page paper justifying what the inflation assumption was for my clients. Previously, I said 3.5% sounds about right. So I think there is something that... I also think the costs of internal model, I don't know what people gain from that. A very wise man said, no one ever went bust from getting the equity stress wrong. They went bust because they did something bloody stupid. So that's a couple of comments I have. Anyway, next comment from the floor. Yes, I know. I've got one question. What is going to be the impact of IFRS 17 and how it impacts with Solvency II in terms of the results? Is that going to... how can boards start reconciling two sets of numbers together again? John, thank you for rescuing me.
Just responding to a couple of points. I mean, actually, yeah, IFRS 17 is a good reason why we don't want to be changing Solvency II. I mean, because there's so much work involved for certain organisations in restating their financial statements and talking about new stories to new audiences. So I would say let's leave Solvency II. And I thought on the gold plating issue, I thought there was remind me, but I thought there was a very interesting comment which said, yeah, we thought we were gold plating then, but so did everybody else. I mean, every regulator, the market thought they'd gold plated. So I mean, just maybe we're not alone in that. And I suspect regulators have their own particular view about what are the important issues in their own market. And I think, that was one of the reasons, presumably, around, what the PRA are doing, because they have particular issues, and I assume they have particular issues in Sweden, which that they want to talk about. But I thought that I may be wrong, but I thought everybody was gold plating, so maybe it's not too bad after all.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, on the gold plating issue. It's harder to find something to write down where you can definitively say that gold plating has taken place. I mean, there are anecdotally views to that effect. And, I think it's also fair to say that, regulators are there to regulate and they're going to have one view and the industry's going to have another view. So you see, the two are never going to marry. I think we do pick up points in the paper where you kind of ask, okay, what's that about? And some of those areas, you know, principally are around the matching adjustment, where there seems to be a rigidity that's been introduced into the regime, which I don't think is necessarily helpful, because generally rigidity increases risks. And there are inefficiencies as well around, the whole thing around equity release mortgages, for example, and the industry there is in terms of structuring these assets so that you get the right treatment. And you know, the matching adjustment was put into Solvency II for the benefit of the UK industry, and it kind of doesn't feel as though it's necessarily being viewed as generally as it could be, I think, in that respect. But I mean, if there's views in terms of gold plating from the audience here, let's please hear them.
There's a contribution from that one. Thank you.
It's just an observation that I think the reason you have difficulty...
Can I have your name again,
Sorry,
please?
Barbara Illingworth. I'm not speaking on behalf of my employer here, but my observation, having worked across different companies during the implementation of Solvency II, is that the gold plating is happening because of the kind of supervisor by supervisor-led implementation. So it's very difficult to pinpoint evidence of it, even though everybody knows it's going on, because it's happening during each company's individual discussions with its supervisor. And I think, for me, one of the difficulties of Solvency II is that companies have to report back to the supervisor what the supervisor tells them the answer should be in order to getting their internal models approved, which leads to this kind of very weird world where you're trying to interpret what you really think, what you think, or what you should think as you've agreed with your supervisor, and kind of find a way forward through that. So I do think gold plating exists. I do think it's worth figuring it out, the industry figuring it out where it's really happening. But I think one of the difficulties is it's happening to each company slightly differently.
Thank you. Next comment from the floor. Here.
Hello, my name is Wali Chishti. I think Paul Fulcher made a good point about the risk margin and how it had been considered. It came from the cost of capital approach in the market consistent embedded value. Because I think if you accept market consistent is the way forward, then the risk margin makes sense from a theoretical point of view, that you have to compensate people for the non-hedgeable risks that they take on. I guess so it's not necessarily a problem with the risk margin per se. I think the issue is with the rate that the cost of capital is set at, and especially that is unchanging in high or low interest rate environments. I think that's the nub of the issue with the risk margin. And if we can narrow it down to that being the nub of the issue, then hopefully the professional, somebody will be able to come up with possibly a much better suggestion to fix that.
Thank you very much.
So can I comment very quickly on that? Because I agree. I think one of the points I was trying to make when I did the presentation was I did go back to the CFO forum paper from 2005-6, and it very clearly said, we think there should be a fixed cost of capital. In other words, it was part of the point I was trying to make about self-inflicted wounds. I do think it's easy to sort of blame other people and say gold plating and regulators over there, and I think a lot of the problems with solvency were self-inflicted, including by people in this room, myself included.
I think the other thing too is if you run a with profits life book, you ask what the fuss is about cost of capital risk margin, because it comes out at 1% or 2% of liabilities. You're more or less saying, well, so what? At the most, without any loss of solvency, it's around about 10%. So I think it's actually been caused by things like the longevity stress and low interest rates, rather than anything else.
It's clearly an annuity issue, and it's an issue that affects the pricing of annuities for consumers. And I think it's widely recognised that it is broken. I take your point. I think there is a good solid argument for having a risk margin. And certainly from my own personal perspective, you know, when we used to do M&A deals, we used to look at the capital that was locked in, and we used to apply a cost to it, but we used to discount it at an equity risk rate, not a risk-free risk rate. And so I think, you know, is it Campbell still Dewey? He produced a paper on it as well. I think that's one of those areas where it needs further research. There's a lot of different models, a 75% VAR type model. And I think, Andy, you're on a working party that's looking at it.
Yeah. I mean, we had our first meeting today. Paul is also a member. We are looking at risk margin issues generally. We haven't quite fixed the brief yet, but I think it will be quite wide, including the question, why have a risk margin? But it's interesting, if you go back to the 2007, I think, there were two options on the table. And one was the cost of capital, which was the Swiss method, and the other was 75%, which was the Australian method. And they're both fundamentally different methods, and if eventually the European Commission chose the cost of capital method, largely on the grounds that it was easier to apply in practice. So, with all the difficulties of calculating a risk margin, that was one of the reasons why we've got it. But there is a question, should we have one at all? And if so, why should we have it? And I think there's a very fundamental question there. And I think because they were considering two different methods, I mean, my personal view is that it was being seen as everything that's gone to best estimate market consistent. It was being seen as just a general prudence margin. And it required some sort of intellectual justification. And we've ended up with this unmanageable, hugely complicated, very volatile beast, and maybe 25% of SCR would do. Easy to calculate.
Next contribution from the floor. I've got one thing, which is I think the trouble with Solvency II is it focuses boards too much on the very rare occurrence, the 99.5 percentile risks. Whereas sometimes they need to be reminded about the BAU type risks, the things that can happen every 3 or 4 years. So they need to actually work out not only management action plans for very rare risks, they need to work out management action plans for what they will do if the stock market drops by 20% tomorrow, which is a fairly common occurrence, in my experience. And I think that tends to get left behind by risk committees a little bit, who start focusing on very rare and very damaging risks. There is someone there.
Hi, my name is Natasha Saunders, and I actually work in general insurance, not in life insurance. But I wanted to make some comments on the subject of gold plating, specifically gold plating that may or may not be happening by the PRA. My view, this isn't necessarily my employer's view, is that the PRA have definitely gold plated the requirements. There was a consultation paper they released not long ago around the national specific templates and reducing some of the burden, as they put it, of the national specific templates. And it honestly just felt like a token gesture, the things they put in there. They put in as many increases, the number of things they were asking for as decreases. And I think the response from the ABI as well was quite similar along those lines. One of the other points, this particularly impacts us, is the requirement of internal model approved firms to still calculate the standard formula once a year, as from their point of view it's the only way of measuring model drift. And like, well guys, couldn't you have thought about this in the many, many years leading up to Solvency II implementation, how you were going to measure model drift and how you were going to monitor these models over time? and instead you're asking people to actually complete a very onerous calculation. It kind of putting firms off even creating an internal model in the first place.
Thank you. Next contribution from the floor. I wanted to ask, possibly, I'll do it now, I was going to do it at the end, if we could have a show of hands. Who thinks that Solvency II has met its objectives broadly? Okay. Who thinks it hasn't met its objectives? And there's lots of people who don't know. I think it's but overall, the show of hands shows that, in fact, it's broadly met its objectives, which is quite interesting. Okay.
Just to respond.
Wait for and say your name, please.
Jim Webber. I work at Queen Mary University of London, which thankfully hasn't had to comply with Solvency II. I did work in Solvency II in the first decade of this century. Luckily enough, I didn't really do much work in the second decade of the century, so I avoided all the hard work. The question about did it meet its objectives is arguably the wrong question. Like every project, Solvency II kicked off with a load of objectives which were probably unachievable. Harmonisation. When you have a life industry that is so diverse and with such different product sets across Europe, how can you possibly achieve harmonisation without breaking the industries you're trying to regulate? It was never going to be achieved. Also, when we say has it achieved its objectives, what do we compare it to? Do we compare it to a 2000 Solvency I regime, where we'd never heard of ICAS? Or do we compare it to a 2012 regime, where probably most life companies were effectively managed under ICAS? I think if you compare it to 2000, you'd say this is much, 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 much better. And actually, I would say, relative to ICAS, where I think the regulations were probably roughly 2 sides of paper, perhaps they were slightly longer than that, we have actually something which is more robust, more stable, more sustainable, and that's all very, very positive. I'd also say that I think the paper as a whole, it's inevitable, it's not really criticism, and also the responses to the questions, does very largely come from a UK perspective. Probably very, or relatively few people have got a good understanding of how disparately Solvency I had been implemented across Europe. And don't forget, with Solvency I, what we effectively were working on was an infinite transition period. So a reduction to something like 16 years is actually quite a big reduction, quite a big improvement in things. Under Solvency II, we actually have a framework that does allow regulators to make changes in future. I think there is a recognition that the first stab at Solvency II isn't necessarily the final stab, whereas I think in many countries, the changes to Solvency I were pretty minimal. The UK would probably be the exception. Finally, different subject. If you're looking for evidence of gold plating, we had 2 lovely examples there. I would say the difference between what the industry says about the PRA and what the PRA says about itself. If you read most of the PRA publications, most of their speeches about Solvency II, everything is fine, just about. If you listen to what the industry says, particularly anecdotally, some of the stuff coming from the API, things have been very, very badly flawed. And I would say, particularly on the life side, I think there's been a breakdown in trust between the regulator and the regulated. People tell me this has never happened, but I'm sure there are internal model changes. to a basis first proposed by good professional people working in the first line, which had then been reviewed and challenged and quite possibly changed by people in the second line, which had probably then been kicked into touch and possibly amended again by someone from an auditor or a third-party firm of experts, which then went to the regulator and was changed again. And how many actuaries does it take to calibrate an internal model is quite an interesting question, I think. No, that's probably all, but hopefully some things for you to think about.
Next contribution. I've got one question which I would like to ask the working party. What one thing would they change to improve Solvency II for the policyholder and his protection? Because that's what we're supposed to be about here, rather than worrying about our employers. So, what one thing would they change? And if anyone has any ideas from the floor, I would be really glad to hear them.
Can I suggest you subtly change that question to what would you change in the interests of policyholders?
Yeah. Jim.
Sorry, it's me again. That's quite an easy question for me, really. I'm probably the only person in the room that thinks this. I would take out the internal model. I was staggered when I read the questions and challenges raised in the paper. People complaining about cost and benefit. How many of the issues actually arose out of the internal model? The scenario I outlined a couple of minutes ago arises solely as a result of the internal model. Which customer benefits materially from the internal model? Are companies really going to use the internal model to better manage the risks in their business, to get a better insight into the way their business performs, or is their first priority to actually reduce their capital requirements? I would like to see incentives for good management of the business and good use of models, but I'd prefer to see the regulators determining the capital requirements independently. Internal models are so ridiculously complicated, and I'm not going to read all of this, but if you read Andy Howding's 2012 paper, Dog and the Frisbee, he talks about complexity, and he talks about regulation becoming complex. And a lot of that is about internal models. And he says it requires a regulatory response grounded in simplicity, not complexity. I think that's one of the most powerful statements I've heard about Solvency II, even if the paper is not about Solvency II. So that's my one change. Sorry that it puts a few actuaries out of business.
Thank you. Now that's a pretty controversial statement. Is anyone going to speak up in favour of internal models, or should we now assume that the profession as generally thinks that it should be done?
Steve, one very quick correction. I'm not against internal models.
Thank you.
So my name's Andrew Hitchcox. Half in favour of internal models, half more in favour of capital models. So I'm sure there are many actuaries in the industry who are frustrated. They've worked for multinational groups who had economic capital models for years and years and years, and along came Solvency II. If I just share our experience of it, just two points I'd like to make. We're part of a group that wants to have a Standard & Poor's strong ERM rating, and I'm sure people have heard me say this many times over the previous years. There's an excellent document by Standard & Poor, how they grade your use of economic capital models, and it's about 60 pages long. So we felt very frustrated when along comes Solvency II with hundreds of pages to implement an internal model. And the second point we found is just maintaining that documentation adds about 30 to 50% to our capital modelling team's resource requirements. And we think the Standard & Poor economic capital model document was much higher quality. So it's not gold plating by the PRA. We just feel that the whole excessive detailed burden of internal model documentation is a cost which does it get past the policyholders? Does it reduce return on equity? Not quite sure. But it's a burden there. And it also slows down our responsiveness to running the business. I'm sure there are many groups around the world who feel that their own internal capital modelling was perfectly strong, perfectly adequate, and then there's this extra 50% cost burden on it, purely driven by the Solvency II text requirements.
Thank you.
Actually, can I ask, is that in connection with a life company or a non-life company?
So I am a non-life company, that's correct. I'm part of a group, though, which has life and non-life interests and has to work across both. And for probably 10, 15 years of my career, I worked for Swiss Re, who have got a very strong life and non-life mix, and they managed that perfectly well before Solvency II came along.
Okay. Next contribution from the floor. Anyone else going to speak up on behalf of internal models? So far we've had slightly negative views of internal models and their usefulness in terms of their approach within Solvency II, although they are useful for boards and risk management.
I think, Steve, it's worth commenting that in many cases internal models produce a higher capital requirement than the standard formula simply because they are addressing limitations of the standard formula. Equity volatility risk, for example, is not reflected in the standard formula. So at least in terms of your policyholder protection agenda, it's not always bad for policyholders for a firm to have an internal model. And in some cases, the regulator is actually encouraging firms to use an internal model because they know they know the deficiencies in the standard formula.
Thank you. Okay. Any further contribution from the floor? What further contributions, I should say? Hang on a second. Wait.
I used to work with Dylan a while ago, but I hope you don't mind me saying that I'm not sure that higher capital does protect policyholders. I think if you make products uneconomic because of their capital costs, then actually you're not achieving your aims of Solvency II and you're not protecting, you've got fewer policyholders and you're not protecting them well longer term.
Okay, thank you. What further contributions? Got a few more minutes. I'll come to you in a second.
Hello, Stephen Finlay. Just a quick follow-up from that, which I agree with. I think the subtle change in the question was an important one, because if the question is about policyholder protection, then we get into a never-ending ratcheting of capital requirements and regulation in general. And of course, when you look at the regulator's statutory objectives, that is the objectives which steer them. But when you think about policyholder impact more broadly, I think that is a far more interesting question, and it's about where do we want to strike that right balance, and how do we avoid, to sort of use a phrase, ending up with the financial stability of the graveyard. Because we'll certainly have stability if we have no policyholders and no insurance companies.
And no one buying any policies at all.
Yeah, and we don't have available and affordable insurance with all the societal benefit which goes along with that.
There is a point over here.
Hi, Sir Wali Chishti. Just on that point on the internal model, if you think back to the financial crisis, the immediate aftermath of the financial crisis, and the anger that the general public had against bankers and the financial services in general, if you try to explain to the the customer, the policyholder, that the regulation allows a company to calculate its own capital, use its own model to work out how much capital it needs to hold. I mean, we're in the profession and we can kind of understand it, but trying to justify that to a non-financial professional, it can be quite difficult, especially when they're angry, especially in the aftermath of the financial crisis. So you can see why that's a good point from the lecturer about getting rid of the internal model. However, the internal model can still be useful in Pillar 2. So in Pillar 1, you could make a case that everyone has to use the same standard formula. Everyone knows the weaknesses of the same standard formula, so everyone knows investors, they can allow for the weaknesses of it. But then in Pillar 2, where you have your own risk and solvency assessment, there you can make the internal model as sophisticated as you want without the regulator interfering on how you should do things. And maybe that would be the place for the internal model in Pillar 2.
Okay, thank you very much. I always think too that in fact deficiencies in the standard formula probably should be dealt with by changing the standard formula. But there you go. If you're missing some risk, then you should allow for it by changing the standard formula. The other thing I wanted to just briefly mention on standard formula is it seems a little bit odd that life risks or trend risks, you're getting the assumption wrong, and general insurance is all volatility risk. So there's no volatility risk on the life insurance side, and there's very little trend risk on the general insurance side. And that, I think, is a failure of the standard model. I think in terms of actually how it allows the things.
Steve, if I could, I did want to respond to your earlier question to the Working Party members as to, is there anything we would like to change? I don't speak on behalf of the other members in this respect, but from my own personal experience, it's really the cost aspect and the streamlining of the application procedures. So in the paper, we quote a figure which we got from the ABI, and Stephen, you can correct us if we're wrong, but circa 3 billion spent on implementing Solvency II in the UK to date, and clearly that
you start earning up these 3 billions, they start becoming real money in the end.
Yeah, it can't be wholly in the interests of customers to spend that much expense on implementing it. So, I mean, in my day job, I see the complexity of the applications which we have to submit on an ongoing basis to amend the matching adjustment, to change our internal model, and it does strike me as somewhat over-engineered, and I wonder if going forward there can be some ways to streamline these processes. And I think the 3 billion spent, unfortunately, that ship has sailed. So I'm not sure how we'll get that back. But
through better risk management, obviously. I have time for one more contribution from the floor. Okay. I'll now ask Dick to actually respond on behalf of the Working Party, and then I'll turn to Andrew.
Well, fortunately, I've been able to respond along the way on some of these, picking up Paul's comments about the objectives are, to an extent, at odds, and then there was another comment about, you know, are we doing the right thing, measuring it relative to its objectives rather than replacing what it had before. I think it's interesting. I mean, I guess some of the objectives are at odds, and I think one that was mentioned was things like financial stability would be at odds with market consistency. I think there's a case of the question is, can you mitigate some of those risks? You know, can you better have a regime that reflects the long-term nature of the liabilities and allow changes to market movements be spread over time? I think that, you know, this general question, I agree entirely with what Dylan was saying about, you know, what would you change? I think just a general relaxation of some of it around, you know, some of the complexity. We've talked about models here. I think the models are too complex. I think as a working party we felt that the models were too complex. The trouble is the behaviour of the industry is that you tend to optimise to the set of rules that you've got, and that's an unfortunate consequence of having measures of risk that don't reflect the risk, I guess. And otherwise, I'm not sure that I'd necessarily pick up much else other than the actual cost of this, which, as you say, has been enormous. And I think it's interesting. IFRS was mentioned, IFRS 17. Solvency II almost feels like business as usual now, and I think the need for stability is absolutely correct. And this comes up in the Brexit debate that nobody wants to move to a different regime. But there are probably, it's fair to say, one or two areas that are worth fixing. So all I want to now say is to say, look, thank you for your input, which has added some very interesting perspectives, and that will go down in BAG and enhance what we've tried to reflect in the paper.
Thank you very much. I'm going to introduce our closer, Andrew Chamberlain, who should require no introduction, but there you go. He is the Chief Actuary of Just, and he is the Chair of the Professions Life Board. I think it's fair to say he has seen regulation of insurance companies from both sides in his varied and distinguished career. Andrew.
Thank you, Steve. I think it's quite difficult to draw clear threads from tonight's discussion because it's widely ranged, but then Solvency II is a very wide subject. I think we started off with quite a lot of discussion on gold plating, the costs of the implementation, the complexity both of internal models and of the regime itself, and quite a few comments about the bureaucratic nature of a lot of the surrounding materials, the volume, the sheer effort that's involved in doing anything in the Solvency II regime. And one does have to question whether in the UK context it actually has really raised the bar, or whether that is just something that was developing anyway. Does Solvency II, particularly in the Pillar 2 also regime, really require anything that the old GenPru did not? And I would question whether it really does, because GenPru did require an awful lot of those things to be in place. I think the risk margin obviously raised its head, and the impact that risk margin has. It was touched upon by certain speakers about what is the purpose of the risk margin, and that's a point I made to the Treasury Committee in my oral evidence to them, which I think is actually ultimately, as I said to them, a political decision. How much security do policyholders wish to have, given that they end up paying for it? It's interesting, a little anecdote. The Bank of England, before Gordon Brown sold most of it off, used to hold lots of gold in its vaults. And it was the equivalent of Fort Knox for the UK, though on a much smaller scale. And a long time ago, a few decades ago, up until then, they used to have every night a platoon of foot guards were taken to the Bank of England, and they used to stand guard over the gold all night. They gave that up because it was too expensive. And that, I think, is a useful analogy. Is the risk margin too expensive to policyholders, or more accurately to prospective policyholders? And I think that's a question that does need to be answered. I think the comment that Dick made about the discount rate is a very important one, because a lot of analogies are drawn, but it is probably the risk-free discount rate that makes the risk margin so penal in its effect. The internal model was then discussed towards the end of the discussion, perhaps prompted largely by Jim Webber's contribution. But it was interesting because I think Barbara Elway, earlier in the discussion, had actually answered the point that he made about how many actuaries does it need to calibrate an internal model. The answer seems to be one, and that's the one who works for the supervisor. And I think that we do have to question, actually, whether the industry has any internal models at all. Or do they have PRA models that they use internally? And if that is the case, have we really added value to the process for the 3 billion or whatever it is that actually it has cost the economy or the policyholder going forward? Of course, if you measure it in the economy, it probably is all added to GDP and be a jolly good thing, but I somehow doubt that there is a good return on that. But it has been a very interesting discussion. I'd like to join those who thank everybody for their contributions and their contributions to the Working Party. I'd like to thank Steve for his contributions as well. They don't necessarily represent the views of the Life Board, but that's Steve for you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. It just remains for me to express my own thanks, and I'm sure the thanks of all of us, to the authors, opener and closer, and all those who participated in this evening's discussion. Can I ask you all to show your gratitude in the normal way? It would also be very helpful for those preparing the transcript of the discussion for the BAJ if you could hand any prepared notes to the members of the events team at the back of the hall as you leave the room. Thank you very much. Till next time. Bye.